Hey everyone, it's Eva here, and I want to talk about one piece of spiritual healing that I think can be so transformative, that speaks to an underlying, oftentimes unconscious weight that many of us are carrying around. The topic of today's video is very much about remembering our innate goodness, or even a reclaiming of our innate internal goodness. And this is important because I can guarantee that if you are, I would say the vast majority of the people in our world are walking around with a fear that like they are a bad person, you, including you. So that's the story that I had for many years of my life, and it still creeps up. That's the thing. It's like it's unconscious, and it's a fear that I have of like I must be like a bad person, which then causes like us not to trust ourselves. But your language might be different. You may not think, oh, you're a bad person. Maybe your belief is like, oh, I'm selfish, or I'm not considerate, or I'm not like generous enough. Whatever like your particular flavoring of this might be, you probably already know. But this is really interesting because it's like mind-boggling to me actually when you think about how much most of us must be going around in this world like unconsciously, again, sometimes consciously, but oftentimes very unconsciously, like trying to control our behavior because underneath we are basically afraid that we can't trust ourselves, that if we were completely free, that if we let ourselves be free and do what we wanted to do, that we would be maniacs, that we would be out of control, that we wouldn't treat the people who in our lives like with love and respect. And because of this, then what happens is it distorts our behavior. So then we overcompensate and we try and act from a place of like, that's not true, where we try and maybe we make ourselves small when we don't want to make ourselves small because we're afraid like, oh, I'm a bad person, I'm taking up too much space, or I shouldn't say this, or that's not nice, or blah, blah, blah. Or we like puff up and we try and be like, we again overcompensate by doing something that we don't even really want to do. Like we disingenuously help someone because we're like, well, if I don't, then I'm a bad person. Which to me is like helping someone from a disingenuous place is never helpful. I would rather just not be helped at all, right? Like I have a standard in my life in which I'm only going to be available for things coming into my world that are genuine and real. And if it's not, if someone doesn't want to help me in a way because they don't feel like it, I am happy to allow that to be the case. So I digress a little bit. This idea of feeling like we're not bad, like not good people, or like we're a bad person is so freaking insidious. And I see this, I tend to work with women more often. And so I don't want to generalize and say like, oh, only women feel this way. But I can tell you that a lot of the women, actually most of the women, or all of the women that I work with, and even my friends, like this shows up in their life about like trying to again, control their behavior, almost like they're walking on eggshells, or they're not doing what they really want to do, and they're not being fully authentic and truthful because underneath they're afraid if they just did what they wanted to do, that means that they would be bad somehow. So it's very insidious with women. I see it in men as well, but because again, I work with women, it's almost all of my clients have this. And it's something that I know really well. Like this is like my life's, well, one of my many soul lessons in this lifetime, to remember my own innate, organic, natural goodness. And when you get this, when you are reconnected to remembering that you are the embodied version of innate goodness, oh man, oh my, like I can't even explain to you how good that feels. Like the way that I can even feel it in my body right now, it is incredibly life-changing, because then what that means is when I come into my own goodness, like again, it's this, I can trust myself, I can show up authentically, I can be really honest in all of my situations with like my relationships. I show up clear and sovereign and like just fully myself, and then people sense that and they're like, okay, yeah, I want to be around that person because she's a genuine person. Whereas we kind of have our wires mixed up. We oftentimes think, let me like placate or people please or blah 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 blah, and that's what's going to make people like me. But in the long run, that always backfires in our face. What actually I think makes people the most attractive, and you already know this, is people who are just really honestly fully themselves, because then it gives other people around them permission to be themselves as well. And when you understand that you can be yourself, you are not offended also when other people are themselves. You're like, yes, yes, yes. Like, I see you, and we're just here, and we're like having fun, and nothing's personal, and I'm free, you're free. Like, what a beautiful relationship that can be. I want to talk about why people have this. So again, the topic is like remembering your innate goodness. And I think if there's one thing you take away from this video, like that's what it is. That I want you to walk through your week noticing, actually, like just actually, you can even be telling yourself like, oh yeah, I am working on intentionally remembering my innate goodness, that I at my core am a good person. And then you can start seeing where you start doubting that, right? Like, which is good. You want this information to come up, and it'll show you your reality will show you where you yet do not believe that, or where there might be an alignment somewhere. So let your reality show you. Oh yeah, and I think it's really helpful because then people start to see, like a lot of my clients, they like come back to me and they're like, oh my God, Eva, like I've been walking around not as a free person, almost like I'm in a straitjacket, again, unconsciously, until you become aware of it, then you're like, oh my God, like you have those aha moments where you're like, I've been walking around like this, trying to like be a good person, because underneath, I didn't trust myself to be a good person. And therefore you're like constricted all the time, or overcompensating. They're kind of like two sides of the same coin. So, we are all born innately, we are love. Like at our core, we are love. And there's, various reasons how that gets stripped away. I would say, for me, it was very much because I grew up with a, abusive mother who straight up told me that I was bad. And I internalized that message and grew up with a lot of like guilt and shame. And you may have experiences like that too, but even if it wasn't necessarily through your parents, it could have been through your schooling system. Maybe you were like a really active kid. You just get the subliminal message somewhere that like, not good, you're a troublemaker, blah, 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 being scolded all the time, blah, blah, blah. Part of it is also, what I've seen is like, there was a point in your life where maybe you weren't actually acting as a good person. You weren't acting in integrity. So like, what comes to mind is like people who have been in the throes of addiction, who were like in their illness, were like straight up assholes to people that they loved. And they come out of that and they're so remorseful and they're so regretful. And they have this image of themselves as still continuously, like they haven't forgiven themselves. And so they feel like they can't trust themselves. They're still going to be that way all the time. And that is like so heartbreaking. If you are experiencing that, or if you know what this looks like, then you kind of know what I mean. Like, to walk around feeling shameful and guilty all the time is suffering. Other ways that this shows up, really, it's just like our society, right? The way that a lot of us are born or are raised, are taught like you're either good or you're bad. And so many of us are going through the world like with such the earnest, good intention of wanting to be good, right? So the intention is there, but then what happens is, you don't act, start to act disingenuously from a really good place. But here's what I want to offer. How would you show up in the world, in your life, in your interactions with people, with your spouse or partner or boss or employees or kids or whatever, clients, if you knew, like if you knew in your bones that you were a good person, that you could remember your innate goodness, your innate childlike goodness, how would you show up in the world differently if you believe that? And that's the thing that I want you to try on, because that's going to show you actually where it is that you don't yet believe that you're a good person, and all the ways that constricts your life, where it essentially makes it so that your actions are not free, are not true. And when you start to believe and know and remember and reclaim your innate internal goodness, like the thing that shifts so powerfully is like, well, it's actually like quite profound. Like, what if you got to walk around this world without any shame, right? Because shame is this idea of not like I am bad, not I did something bad, but I am bad. I'm trying to describe like how what does that even feel like when you get to free yourself from that and you get to walk around the world knowing that it's like you get to be your full authentic self. You are finally free. And in my case, sometimes it's just interesting, right? It's like if we have an unconscious belief that we're like not a good person, we actually do these weird things where we ask backwards things, like become maybe defensive, or we guard ourselves, or we don't show ourselves completely. It's just like this wall that we put up between us and the world and us and our reality. And then all of a sudden, when you walk through the world remembering your innate goodness and reclaiming it, that wall drops and you get to trust that who you are in your authentic nature is completely enough. And this is the most important thing, one of the most important things anyway, is that you actually act from a place then of being your innate goodness. Like, so often when we actually, because let me be clear, remembering your innate goodness is not a pass for being an asshole. That's not what I'm saying. It's not a pass for being like, oh, I'm good, so nothing, like there's no consequences to my actions. I don't need to be thoughtful. Like, it means I can do whatever I want because I just firmly believe that I'm a good person. That's called being like a sociopath. That's not what I am talking about. When you remember your innate goodness, it doesn't mean that you still don't make mistakes and that you don't act out from a place of like anger, or that you don't, totally screw up. It doesn't mean that, because you still will. If you're a human, you will mess up. But then when you remember that you're a good person, you get to come back into like a clear space so much more quickly, because you're not like, mired in guilt and shame, and you go down a spiral and you're like, oh my God, and you hide and you avoid and blah, blah, blah. That whole cycle that we do sometimes when we feel shame, like shame just literally, it's like, it makes us go down here into a cycle and it keeps us stuck, and then we can't move forward. But when you remember that you're a good person and like you feel into the truth of that, okay, what I'm asking you is to like really check in with yourself and ask yourself, am I a good person? Like, can I trust that I am a good person? And oftentimes when you are in the stillness of your own body, not in mind, but connected with your soul, the truth will arise for you. And I think living from that experience of your truth is going to be so much more valuable than all the blah, 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 the mind stuff that then comes in. And I want you to connect to that this place in your body and your soul and your heart that will tell you the truth. But so when you are not mired in like shame or whatever, then you can, even when you do mess up and hurt people's feelings, you can come back and do the right thing much more quickly, because you don't have a story of like, and that's associated with shame that's like, that paralyzes you essentially. Because when we're stuck in shame, we are paralyzed. Instead, you can do the thing where you're like, wow, I messed up and I'm going to show up for this fully, and I'm going to apologize, and I'm going to like make amends and like make things right. And I can simultaneously know that even though I messed up, I am a source of love in this world who was just doing my best. Doesn't mean that you get it perfect all the time. But there is a sense of really like holding yourself and having yourself and getting yourself when you're like, when you can remember again your own innate goodness. And I think the other thing that I wanted to mention was like, you know, I gave some examples of why we become conditioned into like worrying that we're not good people, or that we're selfish, or that we're inconsiderate, or blah, 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 whatever the story is. A huge factor of this is religion, which is like one I didn't even talk about. So I grew up not religious at all. Like I've stepped into a church maybe like 5 times in my life, and mostly for like tourist reasons. But I did grow up in an Asian household, and I have found that like a lot of hangups that are like religious people who grew up in like really strict religious households grew up with, like I end up having the same hangups. So, but in religion, there is this idea of original sin, which is like so toxic. It is like the most toxic. Okay, let's get into this. This is really interesting. It's one of the most toxic things that I can think that you can tell like a child going into church, or even like a repenting adult. But notice that it's actually so fucking useful for people to control people. When people feel guilty, and again, get back to this shame, like I am bad, and you're told that like, oh, you know, original sin, everyone is bad, and you're just gonna spend your life repenting for your sins. Like that's a really good way to control people and get people to feel so bad about themselves that they no longer trust their own internal wisdom and their guidance and their bodies and their intuitions. So whereas within Buddhism, which is what's really interesting, what I think the Buddha was teaching, the Buddha taught about like original goodness. And this is what I'm talking about. The Buddha taught about how in each one of us, there is true goodness that gets lost along the way. Sure, yes, that gets covered up by other things like jealousy or greed or blah, blah, blah. Yes, that's all true. Of course, that's part of being a human, honestly, I would say. But the point is that at our core, there is original goodness, which is the opposite teaching of original sin. And really helpful, I think, for people who have grown up with religion in your life, thinking that you just can't trust yourself and you need to be repenting. What if you actually remembered that you were a good person? Because actually what's more empowering is that when you remember that you're a good person, you act like a good person. When you feel like you are a bad person, you're repenting for your sins all the damn time. Again, that's what I mean when I say you come back into this constricting, God, like walking on eggshells, can't trust yourself, worrying all the time, doubting yourself, blah, 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 blah. Did I do something wrong? Blah, 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 blah. That's what original sin, I think the energy that brings up. And then because you're walking on eggshells and trying to control your every move, then that's when you act inauthentically, and then life gets really messy and you could become resentful, blah, blah, blah. Whereas when someone tells you essentially, it's like telling a kid, I think you are a good person. When you tell a child that I believe in you, you are a good person, that child is much more likely to it activates the goodness within them. And that's what the place that they're going to want to work from, because you're holding them to a higher, more loving expectation, rather than going around being like, you're a piece of shit and therefore you got to spend your life walking on eggshells. And that's what so many of us do to ourselves unconsciously. We are just, we've forgotten our own innate goodness. So again, there's more that can be said about this, and this can be, part of me wants to say this could be a lifetime of work, but also I don't like saying that because I don't think we need to be so addicted to our suffering and thinking that things need to take forever. Sometimes it can happen in an instant. I've had moments like that in my life where I remember one time specifically, I think this is more in my 20s, I was just in a place where I was trying so hard to figure out my life because I was so lost, and there was so much efforting being put in, and there was so much worrying and so much doubt, and all of that was coming from a place of just like not trusting and feeling like I needed to earn my keep in this world. And one day I read this old journal entry that I had. Again, I was in my 20s, and I read this old journal entry that I had that was just, I don't even remember what I wrote, but I just remember I started crying, and the tears just came because I was like, I've been so hard on myself. I'm so hard on myself. And this journal entry that I'm reading is actually taking me to a place where I can remember, like, it was, let's say I was 25, and maybe I was reading an entry from like when I was 21. And it reminded me, like, even at 21, I was trying my best, and I was so earnest, and all of my intentions were good. And I saw myself clearly in that moment, and I cried tears of heartbreak for how hard I was being on myself this entire time. And it's problematic because it's actually when we are when we are trying to fix our lives from a place of being really hard on ourselves, it just doesn't really work. It doesn't work. So that's what I'm going to say about that. All right, friends, I hope this is helpful. I want you to try on some of the thoughts and the shares that I've shared in this video, and let me know what you think, if you resonate with any of this. I just realized I have to run because I have a client call coming up. So I love you all. Bye. Have a wonderful rest of your day.